This COVID-19 infection control and occupational health Listen to the Experts video series was produced by the CSIR. This video clip was produced in support of the South African National Department of Health in its fight to reduce the transmission and impact of COVID-19 on South Africa's healthcare sector.
In this section, we're going to speak about infection control, and we're going to look at what COVID-19 and tuberculosis have in common. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, PPE and infection control transformed from being a slightly obscure discipline that didn't get that much attention to being center stage in the world's attention. PPE in many countries became a political tussle, but for South African healthcare workers, this was nothing new. We have been facing a respiratory pathogen pandemic for many years in the form of tuberculosis. And in 2020, TB and COVID-19 killed equal amounts of people in South Africa. Yet, our response to COVID-19 has been rapid, it had a sense of urgency, and it leveraged resources that we have never obtained for TB. In contrast, our response to TB has been slow and underwhelming, really lacking that sense of urgency that we have seen with COVID-19. There is a practical reason why our response to tuberculosis has been much slower, and it's got to do with the timescales. So say, for example, as a health worker, I'm exposed to someone with tuberculosis today and I become infected with latent TB. If I go on to develop active TB, it can take up to 2 years for me to start showing symptoms. So TB works on this very slow timescale. Whereas with COVID-19, because the time after being exposed to developing symptoms is much shorter, we have this immediate feedback loop, and that is capturing our attention and our perceptions of risk. But just because the natural progression of tuberculosis is slow, doesn't mean that our response to it has to be as well. COVID-19 has diverted so much of our attention and resources, and it is time now to think about how we can integrate our response to these two diseases to make sure that tuberculosis is not neglected. How can this be done? We'll look at 3 examples. Firstly, we can look at integrating our infection control strategies for tuberculosis and COVID-19. For you as health worker, when a patient comes and presents with a cough, it is almost impossible to know whether they have tuberculosis or COVID-19. And so if we use occupational health principles, it means that you should use the PPE that offers the highest level of protection. In this case, a respirator. As the COVID-19 pandemic has progressed, our understanding of how it spreads has also changed. And we've realized that we should be placing less emphasis on fomites, so objects like the doorknob, as ways of transmission, and we should be placing more emphasis on ventilation, especially in indoor settings like healthcare facilities. This offers a great opportunity for synergy between also addressing the spread of tuberculosis in healthcare facilities. Secondly, the widespread use of face masks is a powerful new tool that we can use for tuberculosis as well. Previously, we were using face masks only for patients who we know pose an infectious risk, and in a way that contributed to tuberculosis stigma. If you were in a healthcare facility and you saw a patient sitting there wearing a mask, you as a health worker, maybe the other patients would look at them and think, they are posing an infectious risk. So masks almost became symbols of illness and a source of stigma. But with the COVID-19 pandemic, that has changed completely, and mask wearing is now widespread. Masks are also a really valuable tool for preventing TB from spreading, and not just COVID and all of its variants. So we now have the opportunity to use masks in a way that we haven't done before, and we have the opportunity to keep using masks even as the COVID-19 pandemic becomes history. Thirdly, we should be screening for both tuberculosis and COVID-19 when a patient presents to a healthcare facility with a respiratory symptom. In June 2020, when we looked at the TB testing rates, we saw that they've dropped by almost 50%. That means many patients are being missed, not diagnosed and not started on treatment. The National TB Think Tank have made a recommendation that any patient presenting with a respiratory symptom like a cough should be tested for both diseases, and that we shouldn't wait for 2 weeks of a cough before offering a TB test. But it's not only with patients that we should be thinking about both COVID-19 and TB. It's also for healthcare workers. So when offering occupational health services to a health worker that is ill, it's important to think of both. Similarly, health workers should receive an annual chest X-ray as part of their TB screening. Next, we're going to look a little bit at how to implement TB infection control. Because on the one hand, it is easy to know what needs to be done, but it's often really difficult to do it. So we'll be looking at a couple of common myths when it comes to infection control, both for TB and for COVID-19. Firstly, we're going to look at perceptions of risk. So when I'm speaking to health workers about their occupational risks, they oscillate between two extremes. On the one hand, some health workers feel that they are so exposed, constantly seeing patients with infections that are coming towards them, that they feel it's almost inevitable that they will become ill. On the other hand, you find health workers that feel that they are somehow exempt or immune from developing illnesses. And it links a bit with the hero health worker narrative. As a health worker, it is important to try to find the right balance between those two extremes. One common myth that health workers often mention is that in South Africa, tuberculosis is so common, we are all infected with it in any case, therefore implying that it's not really that important to pay attention to TB infection control. And while it is true that health workers have an increased risk of developing occupational TB, and their risk is higher than the general population, that's between 3 times and 6 times higher, and the same is true for COVID-19, it doesn't mean that becoming ill is inevitable. Health workers still have infection control tools as a way to make their health facilities safer. So no, it is not inevitable to develop this occupational illness. It is possible to prevent it. The second myth is that respirators and masks are the most important infection control tools that we have available. This is not true. If we look at the Center for Disease Control's hierarchy of infection control measures, right at the top, most importantly, are the administrative controls. This means we should look at a healthcare facility from the health leadership perspective, making sure there are people responsible for having an infection control plan and making sure that it is implemented. This also involves queue management and making sure masks are used by patients in the facilities. The second layer of protection is environmental controls. And this means looking at ventilation. So are the windows open? Is there a flow of air through the facility? It is also possible to add newer technologies like germicidal UV to help make spaces that are more closed safer. Another very valuable tool is mobile CO2 monitors, which can use CO2 as a proxy for the risk of infection spreading within a healthcare space. Thirdly, we come to personal protective equipment and respirators. So although they are a tool that is easily available for healthcare workers, they are only third in line when you look at the hierarchy of most important measures to make health facilities safe. The third infection control myth is that we should be focusing our efforts on the patients who we know have TB, MDR-TB, or COVID-19. For both tuberculosis and COVID-19, asymptomatic transmission plays an important role. So in the recent National TB Prevalence Survey, they found that 58% of people with culture-positive tuberculosis showed no TB symptoms. This means that in order for us to make a health facility truly safe, we should move from focusing all of our infection control efforts on people who we know have illnesses to making the health facility more broadly safe. And this involves using tools like, for example, improving ventilation in all areas where patients are seen, universal mask wearing by patients, also offers a more universal, a more widespread measure to make healthcare facilities safe. Important to note as well is once someone starts treatment for tuberculosis, their risk of transmitting this infection to others decreases dramatically. And a safe guideline to use is around 2 weeks. So 2 weeks after someone has started effective treatment, it is unlikely that they will still be spreading tuberculosis to others around them. But very often, it's often the people that have the label of TB in their folder that we're focusing all of our infection control efforts on, when rather we should be looking at people that have not yet been diagnosed. In this section, we'll look at respirators in a little bit more detail. So there are 2 things to think about when putting on your respirator. The first one is to look at fit. So does the respirator form a tight seal from your nose around your cheeks and underneath your chin? The ideal way to test fit is to do a fit test. And so that involves putting on the fit test kit and seeing whether you're able to taste the spray that is put into this hood. A quick informal way to check whether your respirator has a good fit is to put it on and breathe in deeply. This is called a negative pressure test. And there you want to make sure that air doesn't leak around your nose and especially cheek and chin area. There's also a positive pressure test where you breathe out forcefully, also making sure that there's no leak of air. Unfortunately, I've got bad news for people with beards, and they are terrible for N95 respirators, and you really struggle to get a good fit if you're wearing a beard. Secondly, we'll speak about filtration, and this is the respirator's ability to filter out the small infectious particles that you breathe in. N95 stands for not resistant to oil, and the 95 says that a 95 respirator can filter out 95% of small airborne particles. Unfortunately, there are problems with counterfeit respirators. In South Africa, SAPRA and the NRCS make sure that PPE comply with quality standards. In conclusion, infection control is a very important part of your job as a healthcare worker because it involves making a healthcare facility safe, both for the health workers, but also for the patients that use it. We now have a fantastic opportunity to try to integrate our infection control measures for COVID-19 and for TB, making sure that our health facilities are safer for everybody who uses them.